The palace gates didn't just close, they slammed, bolted, and deadlocked behind him while the world watched in disbelief, because the prince, who once swore he'd never go back, was suddenly said to be begging for a return with no titles, no protection, and no wife at his side. And if that sounds like a fairy tale gone wrong, buckle up, because this is the part of the story nobody thought would actually happen. Whispers started as background noise, the kind of chatter aides pretend not to hear and tabloids pretend not to print, until a single icy statement began circulating. Cold, official, and so brutally worded it felt less like family business and more like a corporate firing notice dressed in royal. Letterhead declaring that his return to Britain would be a matter of procedure, not reconciliation, obligation, not welcome, and just like that, the narrative flipped from freedom flight to forced landing. For years, he had painted America as the fresh start, the place where he could build a new identity far from palace shadows, but behind the curated photos, glossy deals, and carefully staged appearances, something was quietly unraveling, thread by thread, contract by contract, until the visa that once symbolized reinvention reportedly became the legal trapdoor beneath his feet, and insiders began murmuring that the very confessions meant to sell books and prove honesty had come back dressed as paperwork and consequences. Because here's where the irony bites. The memoir that was marketed as healing, raw, fearless truth was suddenly being discussed in legal circles not as storytelling but as admission, and while fans praised vulnerability, officials were said to be scanning passages with a very different lens. One that doesn't care about trauma arcs or redemption journeys, only about statutes, disclosures, and whether someone with a high-profile visa still checks the right boxes. And while all that legal smoke swirled in the background, the Hollywood dream machine that once rolled out red carpets began quietly rolling them back up. Partnerships cooling, projects stalling, industry doors that once flew open now answered with polite delays and development limbo. The kind of slow fade that hurts more than a loud breakup because it leaves you wondering which call didn't get returned and which meeting suddenly stopped getting scheduled. Then came the house, that sprawling California estate sold as sanctuary, independence, proof they didn't need the firm, suddenly turning into the most expensive symbol of all. Because when money stops flowing like it used to, even palatial walls start to feel like pressure. And reports of financial strain, unpaid obligations, and looming legal notices turned the dream home narrative into something that sounded less like lifestyle branding and more like countdown clock tension. Behind closed doors, the mood was said to be shifting from strategy to survival, and that's where the most explosive whisper of all slipped out, that while he was scrambling to fix status, salvage options, and figure out where he could legally stand, she was already moving pieces on a different board, separating brands, restructuring representation, building a future with language that sounded increasingly singular, not shared. One night, according to the version now ricocheting through media circles, the conversation everyone feared finally happened, not with shouting or theatrics, but with chilling calm, the kind that lands harder than rage, because when someone says they're staying for the children, the business, the future, what they're really saying is the partnership you built your rebellion on just turned into a solo act, and the cameras in the sky can't capture that kind of silence. By the time travel became unavoidable, there were no dramatic motorcades, no glossy farewell optics, just logistics, paperwork, and a flight like any other long-haul departure. Except this passenger once had entire state visits choreographed around his arrival, and now, if the airport witnesses are to be believed, he stood in regular lines, moved through regular checks, and carried his own bags while strangers whispered the sentence that cuts deepest, "Wasn't he a prince?" Across the ocean, the reaction wasn't emotional, it was operational, and that's what made it sting. Because instead of reunion rumors, there was talk of protocols, security classifications, terminated leases, revoked privileges, language that sounded less like family and more like containment, as if the institution had drawn a bright red circle and decided this time sentiment would not be allowed to smudge it. And the cruelest twist of all? The call. The one-story palace watchers can't stop repeating. The image of a son landing back on home soil, phone in hand, reaching out to the one voice that could still make it feel like home, while inside a quiet royal room the decision hovered between blood and crown, heart and history, until hesitation won, the ringing stopped and voicemail picked up, where legacy left off. Meanwhile, oceans away, her camp moved with the smooth precision of a relaunch campaign. Statements focused on motherhood, enterprise, forward motion, carefully sidestepping his name as if it were already archived, and in the ruthless math of public image, survival sometimes looks a lot like distancing, especially when brands are easier to protect than marriages under international microscopes. Now he's back where his story began, but not in the way fairy tales promise, not riding in on redemption, not greeted with open arms, but walking into a country that remembers everything, a family that has mastered silence as strategy, and a public that can't decide whether to see a fallen rebel, a reckless prince, or just a man who bet everything on escape and found out the past has better lawyers than he does. This isn't a homecoming, it's a reckoning dressed as a return, and the most haunting part is that the door he once slammed on the way out didn't just stay closed, it was reinforced. Reinforced again, and now he's knocking from the outside, alone, while the world leans in, hungry for the next chapter of a saga that somehow keeps getting louder even in the silence. And just when everyone thought the humiliation had peaked at the airport gates, the second wave hit. Not loud, not explosive, but slow and suffocating. Because returning is one thing, but returning with nowhere official to land is another. And the message floating through royal circles was brutally simple. Geography does not equal belonging. The cottage he was said to be staying in wasn't some grand estate tied to legacy, just a quiet rental tucked far enough from London flash to avoid daily camera swarms, close enough to remind him that every road sign carried memories he once tried to outrun, and the symbolism was almost too on the nose. A man born into castles now living like a ghost in the countryside, visible to everyone, anchored to no one. Friends who used to brag about knowing him suddenly had no comment, former allies turned into scheduling conflicts, and the same society circles that once treated him like the fun prince now acted like proximity might be contagious. Because when an institution goes cold, people who depend on that institution for access, honors, and invitations tend to follow the temperature drop with terrifying speed. Inside palace walls, the strategy wasn't revenge, it was distance, the kind that doesn't shout but lasts, and sources kept repeating variations of the same line: this is about protecting the crown, not punishing the son, which sounds noble until you realize the outcome feels exactly the same from his side of the gate. William, according to the buzz that refuses to die down, had shifted fully into guardian mode, not the protective big brother of childhood, but the future king measuring every move in decades, not days. And from that vantage point, forgiveness looks risky, proximity looks dangerous, and sentiment starts sounding like a luxury the throne can't afford anymore. Charles, meanwhile, is painted in softer but sadder tones by those who claim to know the mood. A father who still feels the pull, still asks quiet questions, still looks at old photos, but who now lives in the impossible space between personal love and public duty, a place where every act of comfort could be interpreted as weakness and every silence feels like betrayal. And while Britain dissected every sighting, every solo walk, every unguarded errand, every grainy long lens photo of him looking thinner, older, more tired, California told a completely different story. One filled with product teasers, lifestyle hints, brand language about growth and fresh chapters. A narrative moving forward so deliberately that it almost erased the man who helped launch it. That contrast is what makes this chapter sting. He's stuck in the past geographically and emotionally, while she's sprinting toward a future built on reinvention. And whether that split is temporary strategy or permanent shift is the question nobody can answer out loud yet, but everyone in media seems to be whispering about off the record. The public, of course, is divided in the most dramatic way possible. One side seeing a cautionary tale about privilege, ego, and burning bridges for applause. The other seeing a deeply human spiral of someone who tried to break free and miscalculated the cost. And both sides glued to the same updates. Refreshing feeds like this is the final season of a show they've been watching for decades. Old scandals are being dragged back into daylight too. Not as quirky footnotes, but as building blocks in a harsher storyline. Every teenage mistake, every costume party misstep, every tabloid-era headline now repackaged as pattern, because history hits differently when the narrative turns against you. The cruel twist is that for years he insisted he wanted to be seen as just a man, not a title, not a role. And now that the structure around him has thinned out, the reality of being just a man without the machinery, the protection, the automatic deference, looks a lot less romantic than it did. In interviews framed by California Sunshine, there are no grand speeches right now, no dramatic rebuttals, no glossy sit-down to set the record straight, just a long, uncomfortable silence where identity used to be, and silence is dangerous when when your entire life has been narrated in headlines. Because if you don't fill the space, everyone else will, and they rarely choose the kindest version. The monarchy, for its part, seems committed to the oldest tactic in its playbook, outlasting the storm, saying little, moving on publicly as if nothing has happened, because the crown measures time differently, in reigns and generations, not viral cycles. And from that perspective, one runaway prince, no matter how famous, is a chapter, not the whole book. But for him, this isn't a chapter, it's the present tense, a daily reality of figuring out who he is when the rebellion is over. The interviews are done, the deals are shaky, and the one person who was supposed to be fused to him at the roots appears focused on cultivating her own garden across an ocean. The tragedy, if you strip away the titles and the theatrics, is painfully human. A son who feels unheard, a family that feels attacked, a marriage under pressure no fairy tale prepared it for, and a world that turned their private implosion into global entertainment with push notifications. So now he walks quieter roads under gray skies, carrying a last name that opens history books but not necessarily doors, while the institution he once fought continues without him, polished, practiced, and publicly unbothered, which might be the sharpest cut of all. Not rage, not revenge, just the steady message that the crown remains, with or without despair. And somewhere between the headlines, the legal jargon, the brand launches, and the palace briefings, a simple, brutal truth hangs in the air: leaving was dramatic. But coming back like this is something else entirely, because exile feels powerful when you choose it and painfully small when you don't. Small when you don't. Small when you don't. Small.